Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of Actuarial Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. I'm your host, David Nolan, the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications at the Academy. In this edition, I'll be chatting with John Blocher, who's an Academy volunteer on the Enterprise Risk Management and Own Risk and Solvency Assessment Committee, also known as ORSA. John, welcome to Actuarial Voices.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
John, we'd like to start hearing a little bit about our guests. I love hearing the different paths people take towards becoming an actuary.
My path is somewhat similar to many people's path and somewhat different. I went to college ultimately ending with an industrial management degree, and I started in electrical engineering, loved the math and physics, but did not like electrical engineering. Couldn't care less whether the transistor turned on or what its amplitude was or anything like that. So I ended up finishing with this industrial management degree and no idea what I was going to do with it. Ended up on a second shift job as a computer operator programmer, had no idea what an actuary was, and ended up starting to take exams after I knew someone who had started the process of becoming an actuary and got interested in it. And then I took one exam, went to a job fair in the city where I lived, became an actuarial technician at that company, and then eventually passed a couple of exams to be on their actuarial student program, became an ASA at the first company, FSA at the second company. So what I always tell people is I was a walk-on.
Sure.
And it somewhat showed because I didn't have all the exam prep courses that everybody takes in college, and not even any notion of ever being a mathematician either. The other thing that I think is relevant from my very early life is my parents always taught all us kids about how to manage money. And so that got me interested in finance, not necessarily directly in the insurance industry, but in finance in general. And I became very good at managing money, paid for college with a stock that quadrupled based on a loan that I bought stock with, and ended up college with no debt, with some cash and a life insurance policy. So you couldn't even attempt to do that now. It would be extremely difficult because of the way they've pushed up tuition. Anyway, that's sort of the journey of at least getting through the exams and becoming getting to the point of being an actuary.
So, do you recommend borrowing to fund a gamble to play for college?
No, not gambling. I knew what I was doing. You have to be very careful if you're borrowing money to buy something. And I was not careful enough another time later on, and I'm still paying for that one.
Sorry to hear that. I do want to say that you're our first guest who became an actuary by way of industrial management. So congratulations on that front. And I can see what not caring whether transistors work or not would be a barrier.
That's for sure.
You obviously had an aptitude for math. Is that something that you found out earlier or later in your academic career?
Relatively early in college. I would say I was a normal situation in high school. I had some aptitude, but I was the first class that actually was taught calculus in high school at that time, and they were struggling with learning how to teach it. We were struggling with learning how to use it, and then went into college and took the normal math courses for electrical engineering and discovered I did have some aptitude there, and just really had no idea what I was going to do. Dad was an electrical engineer, so therefore, of course, I should be an electrical engineer, right?
Yeah.
And that didn't work out so well.
Okay, so you get your FSA and are well into your actuarial career. What type of work were you doing?
Primarily, almost exclusively, evaluation actuary. I was occasionally doing a little bit of pricing, but it was almost all valuation, almost all annuities. Early on, it was variable annuities. Later, it was fixed and indexed annuities, but almost always valuation. Got very, very deep into different aspects of annuities, and eventually, I would say, more or less an expert. Although anytime you claim you're an expert, somebody wants to figure out how you're not an expert in something. So I try to never say I'm really an expert in something, but I am on a lot of calls for annuity reserves and capital committee of the academy, and have been on that group for quite a number of years, as far as being interested in reserves and capital. Uh, so that's the early years. I've been at a total of 6 companies over all those years, mostly either private or publicly held stock companies, but also at one stock company that was owned by a mutual, which is an interesting experience. 36 years of working in some capacity in the actuarial profession, and a lot of just different projects. I sort of something I get interested in, then I end up doing something in some area.
Are there any events in your professional career that you found particularly notable or fulfilling?
One was in the AG 33 edit that I did. What we found was that living benefits don't play well with waiver of surrender charges, and you have to do something to make sure the reserves are right. And so there's a small edit that came about around 2015 to fix that problem. That was probably the biggest individual effort. Of course, I had a group of people helping with that. Also published relatively recently an issue brief where the long-standing rule is for a company you can take out the profits as a dividend to the owner, but the problem is you don't take out the losses. So when you lose money, you don't take out money, but when you make money, you take out money. So you can effectively ratchet down the capital of the company. So I published, or with some help, published an issue brief on that. No one has done anything about that yet, but someday when it becomes really relevant, they can look back at that paper and say, "Hey, somebody told you this was happening," and
Right.
they can work on it.
So, to get that straight, when a company makes a profit, money can be taken out. But when the opposite happens, a loss occurs, they don't have to put money back into the company.
Right. There's no memory in the system, and
Mm.
that's I was proposing that perhaps there should be at least a little bit of memory in the system to kind of balance that out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most recently, I was involved in the trying to merge the ASOPs, which is Actuarial Standards of Practice, for enterprise risk management into one. There were 2 ASOPs, and we're in the process of merging them into one. I was not on the committee or anything. I was on the ORSA committee that put in a comment letter, but not on the writing committee of that ASOP. And I think by about December of this year, they will publish the final ERM ASOP. I think that's a major step forward for
Sure.
especially the risk part of the profession.
You've used a few acronyms there, so let's delve into them. First of all, though, I want to thank you for your service as an Academy volunteer. It means a lot to us and to the profession. You mentioned ERM ORSA. Could you spell that out and explain its relevance for an actuary's work?
Sure. ERM stands for Enterprise Risk Management, and this is really separate from actual risk management at the first risk owner level. Like somebody might be in charge of a unit, they may be the risk owner of that unit, but ERM tends to be what they call the second line for that company, and they're trying to look at things from an enterprise perspective, make sure the company is okay. So that's what ERM stands for. ORSA stands for Own Risk and Solvency Assessment, which many companies are required to publish annually. And if you do it right, you are actually uncovering the sensitivities that the company has to various things that can happen to it. And you're informing management, they can make good decisions, they can manage the company better, and perhaps avoid the worst of something happening to them that could otherwise happen.
You used an important phrase there, if you do it right. I don't want to delve into doing it wrong, but perhaps we could discuss some of its pitfalls.
Well, the pitfall in all of risk is that management views it as a check the box exercise.
Mhm.
So that's when things start to go wrong, where it's just oh, regulators made us do this, so therefore we did this thing. It really should be used to help inform the management of the company as to what they're really exposed to. And some people would talk about the risks and the opportunities. Typically, it's the risk that's the problem, not so much the opportunities. You have plenty of people trying to preach all kinds of opportunities at the company to do this and that and the other thing. But for risk, it tends to be a little bit more of a lonely venture, so to speak, because you're the one trying to say, okay, we really need to control this thing, perhaps transfer the risk or figure out how much risk we can take or hedge the risk or whatever. Um, so that's the aspect that is most interesting is what's important enough that you have to actually do something about and what's not so important that you don't have to worry so much about that thing. So it's
Mhm.
this weighing of what the most important risks are. It becomes the important job of the chief risk officer and
Sure.
the ERM director and those kinds of positions.
And I imagine that for some companies, there are risks that are prevalent throughout the industry. And then some will have their own unique risks due to the work they do that perhaps only insiders would know about.
Yes, and at each company, the ERM area may be organized entirely differently.
Mm.
So at some larger companies, you might have a huge risk area, and all they do is sit around and run different scenarios on little models and come up with this will do this and this will do this that may or may not be listened to by anybody. At other companies, especially smaller companies, you're going to take a much more practical approach of how does this help me manage the business? What problems can you help me solve in my business? And it becomes a much more um, interactive, synergistic approach than just an empty risk area there sitting there doing something.
And is the ASOP that's coming out going to give people pointers about how to proceed?
Yes, it should help explain the enterprise risk management control cycle, the whole cycle from identifying a risk and dealing with the risk and then monitoring the risk. This was the problem of the prior two ASOPs that they kind of split it up, and if you read both of them you felt like you were reading the same thing but they were
Mm.
slightly different. So now you can see it just once, you can see the whole cycle, it's very holistic. And I think that as we go forward, if there are edits needed because practices change, it's just one thing to edit and it can move much more fluidly than it could before.
I look forward to seeing the fruits of all that work in the coming months. Are there other products coming out in the next cycle that you'd like to share with us?
I think that the main activity is the ERM ORSA committee itself,
Mhm.
and to some extent, it's a little bit of a pick and choose what you want to be heavily involved with or little less involved with because they're involved in a variety of sub activities that happen from time to time. If I think a comment letter needs to go in, I will pretty much drive a comment letter process for a specific ASOP. If there have been other issues like the liquidity paper, I didn't help write the liquidity paper, but I gave them a bunch of feedback. I didn't help somebody else write a hedging for the accounting group paper, but I gave them a bunch of feedback. So a lot of what I do is a little bit more behind the scenes there, but uh, but I am pretty active on the ERM ORSA committee and think that it really helps accomplish sort of a broad view of risk. For me personally, what I'm involved in lately is non-forfeiture very heavily, both on the annuity and the life side, and it relates to risk because if you let too many problems be, become established in your line of business, you have to actually do something about it. So what I talk about a lot is you have to cut the tail off the risk. You have to stop doing the thing that's hurting you, and then you clean up what you have already if you can. And a lot of times time will help you with that.
But I imagine time can also be your enemy if you're not cleaning up as you go along.
Right. And so a lot of the problems I run into at times are because somebody left something go for quite too long. Another aspect that I probably should talk about ERM wise is what I find is a lot of people don't actually read the rules of what they're supposed to be doing. And so they run around worrying about reinsurance and hedging and all kinds of things instead of actually reading the rules and finding out, is my company being super conservative in relation to this thing that I'm doing? And I have found, I don't even know how many, let's call it half a dozen relatively large ones over all the years, where if you just read the rules and understood what the rules actually meant, not the way you've interpreted it at the company, but actually stepped back and said, how should I interpret this? You can find a better way to do something that usually saves reserves or capital or increases profitability and all those kinds of aspects. And I can't stress enough that people need to actually dig to original sources and find how you're really supposed to do something, because you frequently find that you're not doing it the way you should have been doing it.
It's a bit like reading the instructions.
Reading the rule book. I mean, and the thing is, most of these issues, somebody has thought about it before. The most recent one I'm dealing with, somebody said something in 1975 and in a written report, and nobody seems to have really picked up on it. So when I get deeper into the whole non-forfeiture issue, eventually I'm planning to write some articles and things to explain that to people. It's not really a competitive advantage thing. It's more of a, hey, let's just kind of educate actuaries, educate the industry on this.
Excuse my ignorance, but can you explain non-forfeiture to us?
The 1 minute definition is, it's to make sure that you're getting something out of the life insurance or annuity that you bought as a policyholder. Typically it starts with cash value, but the issues come in when it's something other than cash value, specifically for whole life, whether it's extended term insurance or reduced paid up. Those are the two that cause issues, and specifically reduced paid up is the one that I've been investigating quite a bit. Uh, Obviously, those are pretty much for whole life.
Right. My mother ran into that recently and was looking at her life insurance policies and decided that she could drop one or two.
I always tell the very elderly people, whatever you've got by about age 70, you just keep, you don't change anything. Doesn't matter what some agent throws in front of you, you just keep what you've got.
Right. Yeah. Happily, it wasn't a lot and it wasn't breaking the bank, but it was sobering that these kinds of things need to be constantly evaluated. And people need to be well advised, because not everyone has the wherewithal to understand everything that agents and others are throwing at you. Before we move on, John, are there any interesting nuances about the ERM field that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, there are actually two schools of ERM, at least in my view. The first school is the actuaries who went through the ERM concentration or the ERM exams and think of themselves as ERM actuaries first. They might not have business experience or experience in a line of business, and so they're trying to create a framework and deal with all the aspects of ERM. The second school is the school obviously I am in, because I had all this line of business knowledge, became tasked with ERM at a particular company, and sort of gravitated toward risk. And so the difficulty in the industry is to make sure that both of these schools are represented well, that you don't have one crowding out the other, because we're not making anywhere near enough ERM actuaries to take over ERM. We need the seasoned, experienced line of business people that have learned ERM. We need lots of those people too. So there's room for both schools, and both schools can work together, but there is sometimes a little bit of a friction between those. I would encourage anybody coming up through the exam process, though, to take a strong look at risk, but realize you have to know about a line of business too. You can't just have ERM in a vacuum and think you were going to sit there and create a framework and do all the strictly ERM things without dealing with a line of business.
It sounds like there's plenty of room for growth in the profession, because that's not necessarily true in all other areas.
Right. And the thing to realize too is a lot of times even this chief risk officer, but certainly the ERM director is not an actuary. So that is still a growth area for companies where you can put more actuaries into CRO and ERM director type positions, and it will expand the profession still, even now.
Thank you for listening to Actuary Voices, a podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Please rate and subscribe to this podcast on your preferred podcast listening platform. We're on the web at actuary.org, where you'll find a wealth of information about our work and how you can become an Academy volunteer. And now, back to my conversation with John Blocher, who's on the Academy's ERM ORSA Committee. You mentioned the fact that you're a Chief Risk Officer. Is there anything in particular about that role that you find very fulfilling?
I'd say the most fulfilling aspect is being able to analyze what the company really needs to deal with. For instance, what are the top 5 things we really need to do something about in the company? And you're actually making real change that's real dollars. Usually it's profitability. You're increasing profitability, which increases the ability of the company to continue. You're also a lot of times not changing, quote, the average, because like I was talking about before, you cut off the tail, it doesn't really affect the average, but you've cut off the tail. You've made the worst possibility less bad, or you've eliminated it entirely, and so that bad thing is never going to happen, or it'd be much more difficult for it to happen. And that's really fulfilling, because really the smooth day is what you want. You want every day that you don't have a crisis in the company is another day you prep to not have a crisis in the company. So your best risk managers, everything is just smooth sailing. It looks like it's smooth sailing, but it isn't necessarily smooth. They've just dealt with things very quietly that nobody has really seen, except for maybe a few people inside the management structure. So that's very fulfilling, because you're handling things inside the company, and you're making a real difference for that company in a way that people inside do recognize. Now people outside have no idea what you're doing. It's almost like you're an agent, like you're a secret agent that nobody outside the company knows what you're doing, but a few people inside actually do know what you're doing.
Sure. Making certain that nothing happens is an art. There's been some discussion recently in soccer circles about how some of the best players do exactly that. They ensure that nothing happens in their sphere of influence. You don't see them do that much, but that's because nothing is happening for the other team. And that means they've done their job.
You don't get to be a hero that way, though.
You don't.
But it's okay to not be a hero. The hero is the company continued and everything was fine, and everything just keeps going.
We've previously mentioned your work as a volunteer. Can you share what drives you to do so much? Because it isn't above and beyond what you already do in your professional career.
For me, as a volunteer, one of the key things I've always tried to do is make sure I do enough, but not too much. You have to be able to say no to some things. And I have had people want me to do more than I really wanted, where I pick and choose what I volunteer on pretty carefully. I don't want to be involved in a bunch of organizational calls and things like that. I want to be actually participating. So what drives me primarily in this area is making sure the next generation of actuaries is well educated and actually has a good sense of history of how things got to where they are and how things can move forward from where they are now. I also have been doing a lot of mentoring, either officially or unofficially. I'm an official mentor for Abacus Actuaries, and that has gone really well. And you might say, why am I a mentor for Abacus Actuaries? Well, my wife is from China. I kind of have at least a little bit of insight into the culture and how things can be a little bit different for people trying to work in the US who have come from another country. And it is enlightening, and it's also, I think I can be helpful to people that way.
That's great. As it happens, the Academy is a sponsor for Abacus Actuaries. Do you want to take a few minutes to tell listeners about who Abacus Actuaries is and what they do?
Sure. I'll preface this with I am not a spokesman for Abacus Actuaries.
Understood. Yes.
I consider myself an ally for Asian actuaries, and Abacus is trying to, as they say, break the bamboo ceiling. And typically I define the bamboo ceiling as getting an Asian actuary into the second level of management. So I've worked with a lot of Asian actuaries that are individual contributors, a very few that are first level management, and even fewer that are second level management. And the trick is to try to get them to be into the second level of management. And I think there is some success of that happening out there. It has been perhaps a little bit slower than I would have liked to have seen, given if you tracked how many Asian actuaries are at the individual contributor versus first level manager versus second, you would see that there's a pretty huge drop off there.
And to clarify, we're talking about Asian actuaries who work in the United States.
Yes.
Abacus Actuaries is a relatively new organization, maybe 3 or 4 years old. I was particularly struck by the term breaking the bamboo ceiling. We're familiar with the term breaking the glass ceiling, and I'm sure there are many other barriers as well. The Academy is happy to support their work, and long may it continue.
Mm-hmm.
Changing tack a little, do you have any thoughts about challenges or opportunities, depending on how you define them, that the profession faces?
To me, the challenge for actuaries is how to stay relevant in the individual companies that they are working in. And what I mean by relevant is not just calculating the reserves or creating the pricing documentation or doing all the back office things that actuaries do, but being involved in the management of the company in some way, shape, or form. I think that is one of the biggest challenges. When I started working, actuaries were presidents of companies almost exclusively. Now, actuaries are rarely the presidents of companies, and it seems to have dropped into being more of a technical realm. I am one of the people that says actuaries need to be business people first, which I consider myself kind of a business person first anyway. And so the more they can understand the view of the company from the ownership level, the better off they're going to be. In other words, you're not just there to calculate reserves, you're there to help the owner of the company manage the reserves better. You're there to help manage the profitability, the capital, whatever aspect you're working on. You're there to help the owner manage it better, the management manage it better. You're not there just to do little tasks that regulators or somebody requires. And to me, the opportunity is that if you really understand risk, like I was saying before, the middle doesn't change much. The average doesn't change much, but the tail is much, much better than it would be otherwise. And the more people realize that and realize that's the kind of the objective of being in the risk area, that helps them understand. Because I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people that said, well, this doesn't change the average. I go, yeah, we're not changing the average, we're changing the tail. Right. The tail's the thing that'll hurt you.
It's interesting because in some circles, actuaries have a reputation for not being great communicators. But in my 10-year experience at the Academy, some of the most fluent communicators I've met are actuaries. And those kind of skills are vital in trying to change the tail, as you call it, and explain the potential risks to those in the C-suite.
Definitely being able to tell the story of what the risk is, how to deal with it, how the company can manage something, and being able to say it succinctly. Nobody wants a 15 slide PowerPoint on a risk. They want, give me 2 bullet points or 3 bullet points, and that's what they want.
And the old maxim is that if you can't explain it simply, it probably means you don't really explain it fully. John, I want to thank you very much for your time today and your expertise. Have you any final thoughts you'd like to share with us?
As a walk-on actuary, I would just say to people, don't worry about where you come from. If you are taking exams or thinking about taking exams, just do it. Just become an actuary. There are plenty of different jobs. I would, of course, want people to take a strong look at ERM and risk, but there are plenty of jobs for anybody who wants to do any kind of different thing inside the actuarial profession. It's still, even today, when professions are getting just stomped down, it's still a good profession for people to join. And of course, I would always say, do risk. Risk is always interesting, and become knowledgeable in that kind of area too.
Thanks again, John. I'd very much appreciate your time.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for listening to Actuary Voices, a podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Today, I was talking with John Blocher, who's an Academy volunteer on the Enterprise Risk Management and Own Risk and Solvency Assessment Committee, also known as ERM ORSA. You'll find out more about the Academy at actuary.org. And please rate and subscribe to this podcast on your preferred podcast listening platform.